Well, first off, we just want to say welcome and thank you for being here. We know there's a lot of things that you guys could be doing on a Thursday morning, so we appreciate you spending a few minutes with us. We will be here for about an hour, so around 9 o'clock we'll have this wrapped up. My name is Jason Holland. I'm involved with the leadership here at the Georgia CCIM chapter, and we'd like to give special thanks real quick to Marcy Thomas and the Programs Committee for putting this together, so thank you, Marcy. We'd like to thank BB&T Grandbridge and Cushman and Wakefield for hosting. And before we jump in with our guest speaker, just a couple quick housekeeping items. On August the 22nd, if you guys have your calendars, on August the 22nd, we have an exciting event coming up with Crew at City Tap House. And most of you guys probably know what Crew is, but for those of you that don't, it's a great organization that helps to promote women in commercial real estate, and they do a really good job, really good event. So I'd encourage you guys, August 22nd, and it's a co-branded event between Crew and the Georgia CCIM chapter, and that's August 22nd at City Tap House here in Midtown. So I'd encourage you guys to look into that. On August the 26th, we have a CCIM 103 class being held at the Georgia Realtor Center. So if you guys know of any guys or gals in the business that are actively pursuing the CCIM designation and have already taken the 101 class, we have the 103 class coming up here August 26th. And then on September the 9th, we have a 101 class also coming up at the Realtor Center. So anybody you know looking to get started, get involved to pursue the CCIM designation, I would encourage them to come check out on September 9th the 101 class. And I think registration is still available for that. And then lastly, on September the 23rd, we have a foundations class that we are co-hosting with the DeKalb Board of Realtors. So folks that are looking for sort of an introductory class into the CCIM education, we would highly encourage them. It's a 2-day class, and it's 9 hours of CE. So just a good way for folks that want to kind of dip their toe in the water with CCIM. We're hosting that with the DeKalb Board, so we're excited about that. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Michael Chang. Michael is with Partner Engineering and Science. He has over 15 years experience in the environmental engineering and industrial services industries, and he's been personally involved in the details over, about 10,000 real estate transactions? So one or two, you've done this a couple times. He has expertise in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac requirements as it relates to engineering and science services, skilled in executing acquisition level assignments, including all kinds of specialty consulting assignments, and experience executing large scale multiple site portfolios on all different asset classes. Michael has his bachelor's in environmental technology from NC State. Go Wolfpack. So please put your hands together to welcome Michael to the front.
All right, thank you for the introduction. Let's see. Is the projector, do I need to do anything for that? Yeah, so it's... All right, well, it looks like the projector is starting. I'd like to first say, okay, we've got it up. I'd like to say thank you for having me and speaking to you guys today. I'm going to talk a little bit about due diligence and tools for risk management, how it relates to the commercial real estate industry, talk about the various reports and how it can factor into decision making. So understand we have a lot of different people who are in the room who are involved in commercial real estate in a lot of different ways. So we're going to try and talk a little bit about how it involves people more than just people who are working on acquisitions. I think a lot of people think about due diligence reports as if you're buying real estate or financing are probably the most common ways it's thought about. But we really see involvement from a lot of different stakeholders in different ways. So a little bit about myself. I'm out of our Charlotte, North Carolina office. I work with clients nationally. So I'm working on real estate transactions throughout the country. Partner has about 40 or so offices throughout the country, including Atlanta. So we've got a footprint to really touch things throughout the country, all different asset classes, from say maybe a single condo unit that somebody's buying, not residential but commercial condo unit, triple net lease, up to I know we did work on the Willis Tower in Chicago. So really the tallest buildings in CBD. All right, so what we're going to go over today is, we're going to talk a little bit about the various report users and stakeholders who might be involved in it. We're going to talk about environmental due diligence and what that means. And then we kind of break it out separately and we talk about engineering due diligence as well, kind of what that means differently. And then there's some other due diligence reports, ALTA surveys, zoning reports, seismic reports, that sort of thing. If you guys are primarily only working here in Atlanta and Georgia, seismic wouldn't really apply, but if you're doing things nationally, it might. And there are some areas in the Southeast where it comes into play. We're also going to talk about, as we go through these things, I'm going to give you a handful of case studies as well. We're going to talk about some projects I've personally been involved with. These might be a little bit more worst case scenarios, so I don't want you to think every time we show up, we find $1 million issue, but certainly it is happening, in certain instances. So who are the different stakeholders that are ordering due diligence reports? Like I said, we often think about buyers as who's ordering this, but maybe buyers and lenders are the two that most people think about. But what we see from our side is that the involvement runs much deeper than that. Maybe the reports that individuals are ordering or differ by the stakeholder, but we're really seeing that a lot of different people find uses for the various services that we offer in various third-party reports. One of the things that we've seen recently is a big uptick in sellers being involved in ordering due diligence reports, and it's something that's traditionally been seen as something that buyers would do. But a seller, in order to prep the property for a sale, to maybe get the best price, to get in front of issues, a lot of times they're taking on the cost up front of ordering those reports so that they're not getting caught on the back end with a purchase price reduction or getting caught with something that they're not aware of. Also, property managers, asset managers, or somebody who, depending on a tenant complaint or a planned renovation, might be using our reports. Oftentimes I don't think we think about leasing as needing reports, but we're seeing especially some of your larger kind of national tenants start to require some of these as part of their lease negotiations before they enter into a property. Kind of along that front, I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study where we were working where Tractor Supply was coming in to be the anchor tenant at a retail facility. One of the things that they required as part of that was a phase 1 environmental site assessment that identified a former dry cleaner had been in the space. A phase 2 was done. It was found that there was vapor intrusion issue. So the owner ended up having to install a vapor mitigation system as part on an asset that they already owned as part of that tenant build out and that lease negotiation process. And kind of some of the nuances with that, because it was the owner who was on the hook for this, we took a slightly different approach to kind of minimize the amount of regulatory involvement for that. So that's an example of where a tenant was driving it and they weren't really focused on cleaning it up, making sure that the occupants or that their employees and that their customers weren't going to be impacted by anything. So we're going to start by talking about environmental due diligence. A lot of people think if I tell them that I'm an environmental consultant, that I'm out there trying to save the world, that I'm hugging trees and that sort of thing. And that's really not the case. I would say that our industry is largely an extension of the commercial real estate business. We're out assisting with commercial real estate transactions in some capacity, and what we're trying to do is help evaluate environmental liability. If I tell somebody that a property is contaminated, they're like, great, what does that mean? So okay, you have these levels of benzene that are high. That doesn't mean anything to them. So it's helping to translate that science into something that means something to them is typically by assigning a dollar value to it or helping them understand the regulatory liability, what they need to do if they do acquire the property. as part of it. And so when I talk about environmental due diligence, one of the things, that I think about with this is it's typically the ground and below. So it's things you can't see. It's going to be, contamination typically in soil, groundwater, maybe in vapor. And so oftentimes, maybe if it's manufacturing, you see big above ground storage tanks or something. But in a lot of cases, it's really looking at the things that you can't see when you walk or visit a property. So how do we evaluate environmental liability? The first step, and I would say, this is pretty much the industry standard, is going to be the phase 1 environmental site assessment. We're really looking for potential contamination with petroleum products and hazardous substances, again, in soil, groundwater. How are we evaluating this? In a lot of cases, as part of a phase 1, we're saying we think this is an impacted property, or we think that there's contamination. We don't really know that for a fact, but we're basing it on, on-site reconnaissance that we do. We are going to have an engineer visit every single property. They're going to be looking for evidence of, above ground, underground storage tanks, staining on the ground, stress vegetation, if there's any, questionable operations that are going on, that sort of thing. We're also doing a historical record search. So, I'm going to give a case study in a little bit, but it's not always what is there now, but what was there previously. A lot of times something's been redeveloped and it's new and fancy and looks great, but that doesn't mean that there's no environmental risk associated with it. We're also looking at government records, where we're looking at, what the records are for the on-site property, but then also the surrounding property. And then there's other sources as well. We're calling fire departments. We're looking at prior reports and conducting interviews with neighbors and owners and occupants and that sort of thing. So whenever you get the phase 1 report, I want to just go quickly over what does it say and what does that mean. I really think that 80% of our clients probably only read this executive summary and don't look at anything past it. So you might get a report and it might be anywhere from 500 to 2,000 pages. I think people really look at 3 pages of that or 2 pages of that. And so really the key terms to know is recognized environmental condition. That's absolutely what you don't want to see. That means that we think that there is contamination, or we know that there's contamination associated with the property, and it's typically going to require something further. Next is a controlled recognized environmental condition, and that's contamination that's in place that has received regulatory closure, but there's some sort of activity and use limitation or engineering control requirement that's in place. In a lot of cases, that may not matter. If somebody tells you, well, you can't drink the groundwater, at a property. Most owners aren't going to care because nobody's really drinking groundwater now. It's hooked up to municipal. But what we're seeing a lot right now is, kind of on the redevelopment and, kind of infill development, maybe there's a restriction that says no multifamily development's allowed or no multifamily use. Well, somebody could be looking to, tear down a former gas station and build multifamily, and so that might have a significant impact on how that real estate can be utilized. The next is a historic recognized environmental condition. This is contamination that has been closed, but can really be used in any way because there are no restrictions associated with it. And so then the last would be an environmental issue or business environmental risk. That's typically going to deal more with things like asbestos and things that aren't true contamination, but may have a material impact on how a property is used. So really what you want to see is that the phase 1 recommends no further action, and that we say, hey, we don't think you need to do anything else here. And I'll say that probably in 85 or 90% of the reports we do, that's the case. So I would say that most properties aren't going to be contaminated. So what's driving people ordering phase 1s? So we really see the various stakeholders are being driven for different reports. Definitely pre-acquisition, predisposition. Like I said, sometimes we're seeing more of that where sellers want to get in front of it and make sure that they don't have an issue. Or if they know they've had issues over time, maybe they're looking to just go through and succinctly discuss those, organize it so that it can help potential buyers understand that. Oftentimes we're seeing people, make this available maybe, kind of during best and final or once the second round of bidding happens, so that people can get their heads around it and they're not getting caught on the back end with, something falling out of contract. We're also seeing things on the, before somebody goes into a lease, and then when somebody exits, some of your larger corporations and national type tenants want to know, is there contamination before I come in? Let's document if it's there before we come in, and maybe you address it, or maybe it's just to say, hey, we didn't cause this. This was here before we moved in. And then also we're seeing it sometimes at post-lease. Hey, we knew that there was no contamination when we came in. We want to make sure that when we leave, we have that documented as well, because we have deep pockets and somebody might come back to us later and say, we caused this. So, that's something where, your kind of national tenant might be looking for something. Another one, certainly pre-foreclosure, or if somebody's defaulting on a loan. Oftentimes we see that a property doesn't actually get foreclosed on, but even if somebody's considering, a default, a lender starts to kind of go down this path, well, what if we did have to foreclose on it? Is there anything, that we should be worried about? Maybe they say, you know what, we're going to work something out because we don't want to have to deal with, taking back this real estate. And then, of course, financing, refinancing. Anytime you're dealing with those, there can be additional requirements from a lender. So I would always say, if you are going through that process, I would certainly make sure that you understand exactly what the lender is looking for. The ASTM standard for the phase ones has done a good job of standardizing across the industry what we do, what our competitors do, what most people do. But lenders typically have some slight nuances that need to be factored in. So here's going to be an example of a site where, when you visit this property, this is a adaptive reuse project in the Midwest. It was historically a manufacturing facility, and around 2010 or so, it was converted to medical office. And so it's very high-end medical office. Think exposed brick, exposed beams in a lot of cases. It's a very attractive property when you walk it. And as we were going through the environmental analysis and phase one assessment of this, we found that everything over here in the yellow had known contamination, and the state had closed that out, and there were some land use restrictions in place, but everything was buttoned up and taken care of. Kind of what we found on the, I guess, western side of this property that's not in yellow but inside the red line is that there was a historical transformer manufacturing or repair shop here that had not been looked into. So kind of the concern that we raised is, hey, transformer shops historically are associated with a lot of PCB use, PCB contamination that hadn't been looked into. So that was something that we raised with our client, and I'm actually not sure if they ended up going through with the acquisition or how they worked it out, but I do know that it's something that kind of caught the seller off guard on this, because they actually the seller had some prior reports that had overlooked this historical use of the property. And so, it was something that really caught everybody by surprise, but that our client who was acquiring it needed to figure out. So this is an example of where, hey, just because you're looking at it now and you don't see any issues doesn't mean that there's not anything to worry about. Two of the other high-risk properties, and you guys are probably aware of this and it makes sense, but gas stations clearly from the underground storage tanks and fuel storage and fuel use, both on your property and nearby, because once contamination gets in groundwater, it moves around. And then dry cleaners. Dry cleaners are what I would say is probably historically led to the most contamination. There's historically people were just dumping it out and that sort of thing, and the contaminants are very persistent in the environment. All right. So another one that I just touched on with the gas stations, but it may not just be gas stations or underground storage tanks. So on the left-hand side, we've got a heating oil tank, and this is a former heating oil tank. You can see a fill port here, so it's not always that obvious that it's there. You see this not a whole lot in Atlanta and Georgia. It's typically going to be in the Northeast, maybe the Midwest or colder weather climates. And then on the right-hand side, we have a more of a traditional underground storage tank that's still in use, and this is associated with a emergency generator. I can tell you that right now we're working on somebody who's looking to redevelop a building in the state of New York, and there's a underground storage tank, a heating oil tank that was closed in place. Nobody ever sampled it, and actually we just sampled it this week, or sampled around it, and found that there's free product. And so our client's going to be looking to come in, got this building, it's probably a 12-story building, and kind of completely rebuild it as a senior living facility. And so what we're going to get into is that there is in fact contamination. They're going to have to do assessment, get closure from the state, and do likely some sort of mitigation for vapor associated with this. So really it's something that is part of their overall acquisition and redevelopment of the project. It's something that we can help quantify for them, but it's something that they're going to have to figure out with the seller, and it's really going to be from a dollar standpoint, is how much is this going to cost, and how do we come to terms to make this deal work now that there's, call it $250,000 we weren't expecting when we came into this. On the right-hand side with the diesel tank, this is another example of a tank where our client bought this property. They're actually planning to demo a 6-story building and build multifamily. They're not going to be using this underground storage tank, so they've left it in place. Well, they haven't done anything with the tank, and the state actually just came out and issued them a notice of violation for not registering it, for not removing it, for not keeping it in compliance. And in this case, we had given them a proposal to take it out, but they didn't want to take out the tank until they started the full demolition of the 6-story building, and it's taken them, honestly, we've been working on this project for 4.5 years, so it's taken them several years to get everything going. One of the things that's interesting about this, there's probably about 8,000 gallons of diesel fuel in this tank, and had they had somebody remove that from the tank when they acquired the property, they probably could have done it for free because that fuel had value. Now it's been there for 4 years and it's gone bad, so now they're going to have to pay somebody, I don't know what I haven't seen the cost on it, but to call it, $2 a gallon to come take it out and dispose of it. So now they've probably cost themselves $15,000, by delaying and letting this fuel sit there and go bad. So when it comes to environmental risk, one of the biggest things, and what I would say this is going to be the biggest thing across the industry that we're seeing right now, is vapor intrusion. And this is a high priority concern. It's relatively new. Probably over the last 10 years, the environmental industry has got into vapor, and it's usually, basically, whether it's the state of Georgia, North Carolina, whoever, the EPA, this is really kind of the biggest risk right now. And why is that? Well, I mentioned before, if you have contaminated groundwater, nobody really wants that, but you're not drinking it. The vapor is potentially being inhaled by the occupants of the property. So it is something that can pose a human health risk. And so I've got, an example up here of where we had to do a vapor evaluation off-site coming underneath a multifamily complex. Well, the owner of the multifamily complex wasn't going to be liable for cleaning up the contaminated groundwater. However, they are responsible for ensuring that the occupants of their property aren't being impacted. So that involved a vapor evaluation. Another, kind of case study that, from a project, this was probably in 2016 or 17 that we worked on. Somebody was buying another adaptive reuse project. At this point, the property was redeveloped in the early 2000s into what I would say is pretty high-end office space from historical manufacturing. It actually has a brownfield agreement in place in the state of North Carolina, so it had regulatory closure. However, when this project went through the brownfield program in the late 90s, vapor wasn't evaluated. So what we looked at and said, hey, we know it has closure, but vapor hasn't been evaluated. We think that there might pose a risk to the occupants of the property. So we did, some sampling out there and found that it is in fact a concern. And on this one, they were going to have to install vapor mitigation kind of throughout 3 buildings. And so I know that they ended up getting this was a $42 or $43 million acquisition. They ended up getting $1 million purchase price reduction to deal with this issue. Now, they're in the process of having to deal with it as they're going through and even changing the property more. As they're doing additional tenant build-outs, they are having to install the vapor mitigation. Last I talked to the client, they were expecting to spend maybe $600,000 or $700,000 on that mitigation. So they're coming out slightly ahead, but I guess we'll see how they end up. But so vapor can end up being a major factor as it relates to even on something that's closed if it received regulatory closure a long time ago. So I just touched on this a little bit, but if a phase 1 identifies potential contamination, how do you know if there's actual contamination? Well, that's where the phase 2 comes in. So as part of a phase 2, phase 1 is typically saying, hey, we think there's contamination. A phase 2 is going out and collecting actual soil, groundwater samples, vapor samples to say, no, we know there is contamination. And in some cases, you do the phase 2 and you say, you know what? There's actually not contamination. I think sometimes people look at that and say, oh, well, we just wasted, $8,000. I tend to not look at it that way and say, hey, it's better we didn't find contamination, but also when you go to sell this property, when you go to finance this property, you have the actual proof to show to somebody that there is no contamination. So I think even if you do a phase 2 and it comes back clean, I think that's really what a lot of people want, and I think there's a lot of value in that as well. We have a picture up here. This is another, medical office property where it was historical manufacturing, and we ended up doing the phase 2. Actually, this, the buyer of this property fell out of contract and didn't end up acquiring this property. So the owner of the property came back to us and said, hey, this came up during due diligence. Any other potential purchaser is going to have the same concern. So why don't we have you do the phase 2 now so that we can address it? It actually ended up turning up clean. So now the next person that comes along, they'll be able to show, hey, this is not a concern, the historical use of this. All right, so kind of the last slide to finish up kind of on this contamination and environmental due diligence associated with that is, what if the phase 2 finds contamination? What do you do? Really it's oftentimes you have to do further sampling to characterize. You want to figure out, well, we know there is contamination. How much contamination is there? Oftentimes there can be regulatory involved with that. And then you want to quantify that. So sometimes if you need that really quick, we can put together what's called a remedial cost estimate. That's going to be similar to that $1 million vapor mitigation project that I mentioned. One of the things we tried to help our client with is, hey, they said, okay, we have this contamination, what does it mean? By putting together some numbers, we were looking at, well, it's probably about $1 million worth, or up to $1 million worth. Of course, the seller had their consultant looking at it as well. They weren't just taking the buyer's word for it, but they ended up agreeing on that. And then also it can get into actual remediation and site cleanups. Okay, so you bought the property with contamination. Now you have to deal with it, and that's something where owner's dealing with. They probably hand it over to an asset manager who's like, all right, well, figure this out, or make sure and keep this moving so that we get regulatory closure. And then often we see some sort of holdback or purchase price reduction. When there is known contamination as a way to kind of deal with it and keep deals on track. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about industrial hygiene. This is still in that environmental realm, but we're no longer worried about soil groundwater contamination. You guys are probably going to be familiar with some of these up here. The two that I'm going to focus on the most right now are going to be asbestos-containing materials and mold. What's driving these? So asbestos is in building materials. It's a known carcinogen. And so if asbestos is in place and in good condition, it's really not a concern. But if you're looking to redevelop or to renovate, demolish a building that has asbestos in it, there are federal regulations that require abatement of that material to prevent it being released into the atmosphere. So another project that we're actively working on right now, we have a client who's looking to buy a 20-story tower kind of in the Midwest. And it's currently multifamily, pretty run down. They're going to be going through gutting the building, turning it, kind of making it a much nicer student living facility. And because they have this planned renovation happening, we did a fairly extensive asbestos survey as part of their acquisition due diligence, we found out that there's quite a bit of asbestos in the building. They've already had some abatement contractors walk the building who have given them a number of $1.5 million to abate everything. So really, this is something that's got tacked on to their already fairly substantial construction budget of another $1.5 million. So that's something that they're working through with the seller. I think that's generally an extreme. That's not the normal what we see. Oftentimes, even if it's, hey, you're bringing a new tenant space in, or somebody to take a new tenant space and you got to take out floor tile, that's a more typical sort of abatement that we would see. But that's where even on the leasing or on the property management side, that would be needed. The asbestos surveys are often being driven by the building departments, and they say, hey, that's great, you want this, renovation or demolition permit, where's your asbestos survey? So that's something to certainly think about if there's any sort of renovation or demolition planned. The next one on here is mold. There's not a whole lot of state or federal. There are a handful of states with regulations. Georgia doesn't have them. South Carolina doesn't. North Carolina doesn't have them. But there are some federal guidelines for that. So what's driving mold? And it's often going to be exposure to occupants. Kind of in a scenario you wouldn't expect, we actually were working with a self-storage owner that had a property here in Metro Atlanta, and they had a small roof leak, and somebody had a little bit of moisture buildup in their unit. They had a little bit of mold on a couch that they were storing in there. They called the health department. The health department came out, and it kind of turned into a much larger issue than maybe it needed to for what was maybe less than a square foot of mold. But in that case, it was a tenant who was driving this, right? If you're in a commercial office space and you have somebody tell you that, hey, we're getting, oh, I feel sick because of, and I think there's mold. We were also working recently on an acquisition of several office buildings in Jacksonville, Florida, and kind of at the 11th hour, they actually as due diligence was nearing the end, a tenant lodged this complaint against the property management. So we ended up having to go through and do a full mold survey for something that turned out that we didn't identify any evidence of mold, but it's something that came up kind of, at the 11th hour there. So, I think oftentimes you certainly want to, if you're a building owner, you want to make sure you're not exposing occupants to mold. But, oftentimes that's how it's being driven is kind of, for health concerns rather than kind of regulatory. The next one on here is, if you're not dealing with multifamily, you probably don't care too much about this, but if you are, radon is a concern for multifamily properties, and that's really based on how much time people spend there compared to, say, an office environment or industrial commercial use. And I will say, we've got a map here in the bottom corner that shows the areas that are known high radon areas. Really, you'll look and you'll see kind of the Midwest and the Northeast are where most high radon is expected to be found. I will say that Metro Atlanta area is also a high radon zone, so we fairly often find radon throughout Metro Atlanta. I'll say that the driver for the assessment of this is often going to be lenders. A lot of lenders, especially in the multifamily space, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, HUD, a lot of the life insurance companies are expecting some sort of radon evaluation as part of a financing. So, that's what I would say the largest driver is going to be on the financing side of things for radon. But it is something to be aware of. It's usually not a deal killer. Radon mitigation is not a very expensive endeavor, so it's something that we, very rarely see actually, derail a deal. But it is something to consider and be aware of. All right, so next I'm going to talk about, move on to what is engineering due diligence. So we've spent a lot of time, talking about environmental due diligence, where I said, think about the ground and below, what's below you. For engineering due diligence, it's actually quite the opposite. I like to think of this as what can you actually see, so the ground and up. It's actually the physical structure on site, what type of condition is that in, and what do you as a, owner, tenant, whoever, however you're interacting with real estate, need to know about the physical structure on a property. So how do we evaluate this? Typically, kind of the industry standard for this is going to be a property condition assessment. And so the objective of this is to identify what the asset is, what type of construction is it, what condition is it in, and are there any deferred maintenance costs associated with it? So are there any deficiencies? When you look at the items that are covered on here, it's virtually every aspect of the building, from the foundation to the roof, to the electrical, to the plumbing, to the interior finishes, that sort of thing. So it's all components of it. We're looking at elevators. The type of asset that you're looking at might, dictate what's the most important, right? If you're looking at a, 500,000 square foot industrial facility, that roof is going to be really important because you have 500,000 square feet of roof. It's probably going to be the most expensive building component associated with it. If you're looking at a tower like we're in now, maybe the elevators and the mechanical systems are going to be a little bit more important. So kind of, what's the most important is really going to be driven somewhat by that asset class and your involvement. We've seen some recently too, where if it's a triple net, lease with a, 20-year lease on there, then, and you're buying it, maybe you don't have as many concerns about the condition of the building when you're buying it because you know that, you have some credit-worthy tenant who's going to be in there for the next 20 years. All right, so as we do this, how do we evaluate this? Well, one of the things that we're doing is putting together this kind of list of deferred maintenance items. So one, we found these deficiencies. Again, you say, great, what does that mean to me? Well, we typically try to assign an opinion of cost or dollar value to correct that issue. So, okay, we found these 10 items that are wrong. Here this example is, maybe it's $267,000 to correct all the things we found. And so this is where, it's not a quote, I will tell you that. We're not giving you a bid to do the work, but we try to help give you an order of magnitude of what it's going to cost to correct an issue. So the next item that we also look at that's a pretty critical component is going to be the replacement reserve schedule. So, all right, we've told you what deficiencies you have with the building now. You can address those, however, maybe you negotiate with the seller, maybe it's for your own informational purposes, maybe a lender's doing a holdback for it depending on, why the report is being ordered. But the next component is, well, what about going forward? So what we really try to do on this capital reserve schedule is help evaluate your major expenses, typically over a 12-year period, although we can fine-tune that reserve schedule based on how you're using the report. The 12 years is typically assuming 10-year permanent financing, and lenders typically want to see an extra 2 years at the end of it. But so, okay, the roof is, we expect that you're going to need to replace the roof in 5 years so that you can start your capital planning for that, or your HVAC, your major cost. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the stakeholders for PCAs, and this differs a little bit from phase ones because there's a lot more nuance to property condition assessments. So the drivers for these reports are going to be very similar, but we have a big distinction here that's not on the environmental side, and it's usually going to be, is it an equity report or is it a finance report? A finance report is typically going to be intended only for use by a lender. And when you're looking at that, we're not going to be as conservative for a lender as we are as an actual owner or somebody who is, looking to, I don't even want to say buy a property because we see it with, potential tenants as well. But if you have some other stake other than lending, you probably, want a more conservative approach to that report. So as an example, if you're buying a property, you probably want to know everything that could be wrong with it up front. Worst case, how much is this going to cost so that I can set aside, this money for it, or so that I can have this discussion with the seller. If you're a tenant and you're going in and you're going to be responsible for the HVAC within that space, well, what condition is it in? Am I going to have to replace it in 2 years? If I am, maybe that's a negotiation point, with a landlord, right, before I enter into that lease agreement. And so that's kind of what we see is, your acquisition level, your equity report is typically going to cost more money, but it's going to be a more thorough report, and it's going to have, I would say more of a worst case scenario, whereas a finance report's a little bit optimistic since a lender isn't in the, first loss position. That would be the owner of the property. And so I would be careful that if you are ordering these reports, you certainly want to, make it known what your intention is for the report so that the findings can be, I guess, geared towards making it useful for you. Another example, we talked a little bit about the predisposition. If you're going to be selling a property, maybe you say, hey, I'm only going to show you the capital needs over the next 5 years. I don't care if you need to replace a roof in year 6 or 7, because I'm going to be out of the deal for 5 years at that point, and that's on you as a new owner. And so when you're, if you're ordering that predisposition, you have that ability to kind of, I don't want to say shade the results, but you can kind of help how that information is going to be portrayed. Also, you might say, well, instead of a worst case scenario, let's take a more likely case scenario for what a roof replacement is going to cost, something along those lines. And then two, another thing is, when you're coming into cost, well, there's oftentimes a lot of different ways to address something. Maybe if you're selling a building, you say, hey, instead of, replacing that chiller, just do an overhaul to it, right? And so that's, whereas if you're buying it, you say, well, we'd rather just have money in to replace it. So what are some of the common areas of concern identified in PCAs? Honestly, there's thousands of potential issues that you could come across. A lot of times I've got a handful of things listed up here. Again, it might depend on the type of asset that you're looking at, and it might depend on as what's most important. But certainly, roofs, parking lots, facades, elevators, mechanical equipment. These are all things that we see fairly often. Another one that's on here, and this will again depend based on asset class some, is it accessibility, so an ADA. If a property was built, before ADA was put into place, chances are it doesn't comply, but there is no real grandfathering for ADA, and you might have to make upgrades to the property as part of future renovations, or even right away, depending on what those items are. It kind of gets into a little bit with dealing with attorneys and that sort of thing with how you implement accessibility upgrades to a property. So next I've got a case study. This is another project we just recently worked on. This is another medical office building in the state of Colorado. This is not a very big building. We're talking, I want to say this was a 30,000, maybe 33,000 square foot, two-story medical office building. When we were out there, this picture is, up here shows the white staining on the stucco, and we were just seeing some things that didn't look right. So this is something where we told our client, hey, you need to make some repairs, you need to paint this building right away, but we also recommend doing a deeper dive on this because we think this could be a bigger issue. As they dug into it, this building was actually part of a condominium association because there were 3 buildings, and they found a $600,000, I guess, credit to the homeowners or deposit to the homeowners or to the condo association associated with the settlement related to the facades. And as they kept digging, more and more reports came up, and they ended up finding out that this was a 12-year-old property. The stucco had already been replaced once in 2014 across the entire building, and there were other reports indicating more deficiencies, and a contractor had given this quote, these costs up here from documents we actually received, of $2.2 million to go through and do kind of a reskinning, replacement of windows of the entire property. So this is, again, kind of a worst case scenario. We don't normally see $2 million on a building of that vintage or size. But it's where there can be material findings that show up. And I don't know how they ended up dealing with the seller, but I do know they did end up moving forward with this transaction. So next, talking a little bit about capital reserves and capital planning. This is that table 2 that we showed where we're trying to project what we expect, what expenses and costs we expect are going to be associated with the building over the next, say 10, 12 years. There can be a lot of different approaches to this. It can be, are we going to replace the mechanical systems, or are we going to overhaul them? Maybe we can extend the life by another 5 or 10 years by spending $50,000 now instead of $200,000, and that might make more sense based on whatever hold period you're looking at. If it's a long-term hold, maybe you replace it. If you got a 5-year hold, maybe you overhaul it. With roofs, it's really important to understand is, maybe you can put a coating on that roof to extend the life of it. If there's only one kind of roofing system in place, you can probably overlay it and just put like a new single ply membrane on top of that at a much lower cost. If there's already 2 roofing systems in place, code doesn't allow you to overlay it, so you're looking at a tear off and replacement where you have to put in new insulation and everything else. So the cost can vary dramatically as you get into details and the approach you want to take with these. You know, kind of the use of a building too, I've got on here. So if you're in a tower like we're in now, a building like we're in now, elevators are going to be a really important component to it, making sure that, Grand Ridge and BB&T aren't sitting there for 10 minutes waiting on the elevator every morning and afternoon. That's probably something that's not going to be great for tenants. Whereas if it's a 2-story office building, if the elevator's slow, you're probably not going to have that big of an impact on the, tenants probably aren't going to be making a huge decision based on that. So, when it comes to modernizing, you might look at those differently based on the, type of property, type of tenants that are in place. And then, last, kind of as it relates to hotels, maybe there's a PIP that's going to be coming in play, and you say, you know what, we're not going to replace this stuff in year 3. We're going to have to do a new PIP, even sooner or later. And you start, the PCA is typically going to recommend replacing with like kind. Maybe you say, well, we're not going to replace with like kind. We're going to make this way better. We're going to change it from a Class B property to a Class A. You might, an owner might decide to do something way more extensive. This photo that I have up here is a project that we're actually working on right now. This is a historical mill property that was converted into multifamily in 2007. And the building is actually on the National Historic Registry. And so one of the things we've had a handful of conference calls on this week is, well, there's a handful of facade deficiencies associated with this property. Well, how do you address them? So we had actually a facade specialist go out, look at the property, and kind of the number they came up with was $3.6 million to remove all the paint from the exterior of the building, to re-tuck point everything, and put everything back with a brick stain rather than a paint. And of course, the person who's looking to buy this building is like, yeah, that's great if we're going to have this as a museum or something, but that's probably not what we're going to do. That's we're not going to be able to make money if we do that. So we've been talking through different approaches with them. And if you take that first $3.6 million approach, maybe you don't have to spend any money on the facade for the next 20 years. I think what we're actually going to do here is adjust it, and we've kind of said, hey, this is kind of the Cadillac. Okay, you don't want to do that. Maybe it doesn't make sense here. So you're just going to scrape the paint in some areas where it's loose, do some limited tuck pointing, and repaint over everything that's out there. I think they're planning to spend $400,000 or $500,000, and that's the approach we're going to take with the report, because that's what makes sense. And they know that, hey, 5, 6, 8 years from now, probably going to have to spend another $500,000. And that's, so really, kind of talking with the client and owner and what they want to do and how they plan to manage the property is something that's pretty important, because there can be quite a bit of variation in approaches for what you do. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about forensic investigations. This is kind of the phase 2, if you will, of a PCA, and it's where you start doing a deeper look. You'll see up here we have a couple different things. You have a roof on the far right, where you're looking at it, you can see patching in the roof. When we look at it with the infrared camera, you can actually see where there is moisture in the system, and there has been some wet insulation and that sort of thing. Kind of the other photo with the infrared here is actually where we were seeing some deficiencies with the EFIS system. This is a senior living facility, and we, told our client, hey, if there is moisture intrusion in the system, it could be a much bigger, issue to correct than, what we know about. So we actually found that there wasn't here. So the deficiencies are really just aesthetic deficiencies that they can go through and address without having to spend too much money. The last one up here, this photo is not from the project, but I actually have a project we got a call 2 weeks ago from a multifamily owner where somebody fell through a balcony. It's a 1970s vintage multifamily product, and somebody fell through a balcony. The resident called the news. They were on the news over the weekend with the, spent one night, nobody was seriously injured, kind of one night in the emergency room with some scrapes and bruises and that sort of thing. But then that Monday, because it was on the news, the fire department showed up, did an inspection, found 2 other balconies, said you can't use these. Then code enforcement showed up and said, you know what, you can't use any balcony at this property. You have to get everything off of the balconies, so have your residents get everything off of it. And these cannot be reoccupied until you have a structural engineer evaluate these balconies. So really, we had a structural engineer out there last Thursday and Friday. The owner of this is actually, I'm getting text messages from him 3 or 4 times a day with different thoughts. He's losing a lot of sleep over this. So, but kind of what we found is that these balconies, while built in 1970, aren't adequate to meet today's code. So he's going to end up having to replace about 130 balconies out there. So this is something that, this is more the forensic investigation side of things. And there really wasn't a lot of evidence of this until somebody fell through. Everything had been covered with vinyl, and you really couldn't see a lot of the deficiencies in the underlying vinyl. And the type of construction that they were, you really didn't know that it didn't meet code until you started, doing some of this deeper digging and figuring out what type of reinforcement was in the concrete and that sort of thing. So, really we have the ability to do these things. I've got up here, typically the biggest areas we're looking at roofs, facades, structural. This could apply to mechanical and that sort of thing as well. But so I think sometimes with these you can start getting into some pretty big liability issues. And then in this case, his biggest concern was that that code enforcement might pull all of his COs for the entire apartments, and then he was going to have to relocate all of those tenants. So next, go over this quickly. Energy audits. This is something we're seeing more and more. If you're in multifamily, you've probably been seeing this being driven by Fannie and Freddie. But doing it, certainly if an owner is paying the utility bills, it makes sense to do an energy audit. Figuring out where you can go through, get your highest return on investment, if it's replacing lighting to LEDs, that sort of thing. So energy audit can help an owner identify how they can save money. We help, what's it going to cost, how much is it going to save you, what's your return on investment. We're looking at all those things. And then you can also implement it in accordance with like a capital program as well. Well, we're planning this CapEx, maybe we implement some of these measures as part of that. So really it's something we can see as being very useful on the asset management side of things to increase, to lower those operating expenses. So, what are some of the other due diligence reports? I'll go over these quickly because we're getting close to near the end of time. An Alta survey, this is basically going to be a pictorial representation of the title. It's going to show, if you think you've got 9 acres to develop and it's only 8.5, that could have a material effect on maybe the density you could put on a property and maybe how you can use it. So knowing that up front is going to be pretty important. Something I've got down here, if you're going to be using a survey for design, you probably want to have your underground utilities marked, have topography marked on there as well. That's something that the civil engineer will be asking for, and that's not something that we would normally do unless it's specified that it's being used for design. Zoning reports as well. This is going to get into, is the property conforming use, a legal non-conforming, maybe it was conforming when it was built, but code changes over time. Zoning code changes have made it so it's not conforming now. Or occasionally we do come across non-legal, non-conforming where something needs to be done to bring that back into a conforming use. I mentioned this quickly, seismic risk assessments. I think the only 2 places, this is where we help assign, a value and risk to seismic. Are you going to need earthquake insurance? The only 2 areas that I think in the southeast, if that's where you guys are in the Memphis area. So I would say if you're doing work in those areas, I would be cognizant of what's happening from a seismic standpoint. I've never actually seen a building fail a seismic report in Charleston, but it is something where lenders are starting to ask for, evaluation of those. Got a handful of, concerns when it comes to seismic, unreinforced masonry buildings, tuck under parking. that sort of thing. But again, it's going to be a much bigger deal if you're doing work in California, Washington State, that sort of thing. All right. So kind of key takeaways as I wrap up is just that environmental and engineering reports are pretty important tools for risk management associated with commercial real estate. Additional investigation in phase 2s and the forensic reports on engineering can sometimes be needed to really get a full understanding of what's going on. The reports needed might vary based on how you're interacting with commercial real estate. You might never need a phase 1, but maybe you need an asbestos survey or a mold survey. And then 2, the approach of the report can vary by the user. So again, we take a slightly different approach if you're selling a property, maybe present it in a more attractive light than if you're buying it. It's going to be doom and gloom a little bit. So, so knowing why you're ordering the report is pretty important too. All right. So, any questions? Yes.
I had a question concerning the vapor intrusion. What type of manufacturing or types of buildings would vapor intrusion?
Sure. So the question is on vapor intrusion, what are the typical contaminants of concern, or what raises that question, or raises that concern? And the answer is going to be volatile organic compounds. That's not going to mean probably a lot to you guys, but I would say chlorinated solvents and petroleum products. So anything is a gas station, or gasoline is something, or like a dry cleaning constituent, or if it's historical manufacturing that use chlorinated solvents, is typically that'd be like a parts washer, degreaser, that sort of thing. So I would say those are. If you have like pesticides or metals contamination, those aren't going to be a concern. Or your heavier oils and fuels typically aren't either, but it's things that volatilize easily and get into the atmosphere. Yes?
On vapor contamination, how do you remediate?
How do you remediate vapor contamination is the question. And the answer is you can, if you wanted to actually remediate it, you can remediate the soil or groundwater. What we typically see done more than remediate is mitigate. So what you do is you make sure that the occupants aren't being exposed, and that's typically by, if it's slab on grade construction, create like a negative pressure underneath the slab, and so you're taking that contaminated vapor and usually using like a fan to pull it and vent it through the building out of the roof. So you're basically not necessarily mitigating or remediating it, but you're just removing it and venting it outside into the atmosphere. That's the most common approach for that. Yes?
2 questions. In New York State, there was, the city got some money from the state to remove some gas station tanks and stuff like that. What could be something in the future that could come back? Because that property is going to go up for sale. And I want to know, what do you have to think about when the state actually paid for something to be removed, and what could come back in the future?
So the question is, if, in the state of New York, I guess, the state paid to remediate or remove some tanks, and what could be the potential ongoing liability associated with that property? That's where it's going to really depend on what they did. And in that case, you'd want to see the documentation from the state. Usually if a tank has been removed or if any issue has been fully addressed, the state will issue a no further action letter for that. And so typically there's going to be some documentation from the regulatory agency, in this case the state of New York, that would say, hey, we've reviewed everything and no further action is warranted for this. So once you have that in hand, I'll say that typically there's not going to be a lot of liability with that. Kind of one of the differences now is that vapor is a known thing. And it's not to say that we're not going to identify something 30 years from now that nobody knows about now. I mean, I can't predict that. But I think if you're looking at a recent closure on something like that and you have the documentation from the state saying nothing else is needed, this has been cleaned up to our satisfaction, that's usually what you need to get comfortable. State by state, you'll get kind of various levels of indemnification, where they'll won't hold you liable, no liability associated with a past release. But that's going to vary more on a state by state basis. But usually a brownfield site might have a covenant not to sue a future owner associated with it. So it'll really depend on the state documentation that you get for that.
Okay, and the The second project was in Georgia, and it was a finance office of a car lot. The car lot was next door, and there was this back area where a mechanic worked, and I was working on the sale. And I guess the mechanic poured some oil in the back. So there was this little black area, not too much, you know, maybe 10 by 10 or something like that. And someone suggested that they scrape it and get a letter from Georgia, and you know, my buyer ended up not wanting to buy it because of that. So what would you know, how does Georgia relate to those letters, and what could have gone on future if he did buy it?
Yeah, so with that again, so we're talking about oil staining where somebody had dumped oil out, and you know what needed to be done to address that. I mean, from what you've described, I would say that's typically not going to be a huge concern, and I think it would really be up to a consultant to help quantify that risk and identify what it is. But typically what you would do is you would remove that staining. You would maybe go a little bit deeper. You can screen to make sure it's all gone, and then once it's gone, you'd want to take a couple actual soil samples from beneath it where you think you're in clean fill to show, or clean material, to show that it's fully been removed, and then you could submit all that documentation to the state, and they'll typically issue you a closure letter saying, yeah, you removed it all, it's been documented, you have a clean closure. And that's what you'd want to be able to show to any future lender, buyer, that sort of thing. Yeah, there was this issue. Here's the documentation, the steps we took to address it, and here's proof that it was actually cleaned up and no contamination remains in place.
Let's give Michael a hand.
Thanks.
So real quick, for the conscientious service, time ran a couple minutes over. My apologies. Just want to let you guys know 2 quick things coming up. Again, August 22nd, that Thursday, City Tap House. We're doing that event with crew. And then on September the 12th will be our next chapter meeting, and it will be a lunch meeting. You guys have to get up early to get here, so we'll update you guys on that. But September 12th is our next meeting, and it'll be a lunch meeting. So thank you for being here. Drive safe on your way to the office, and have a great rest of your week. Thank you. Good.